Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the Lab 3 video on DNS in Server 2003. In this video, we're going to take a look at a detailed DNS installation inside an Active Directory environment. And what we're going to focus on in Labs 3 and Lab 4 is setting up a whole DNS hierarchy first internally. Lab 3, we're going to focus on DNS inside a domain. So let's take a look here. Let's actually start with this one here and talk about some of the things we're going to do. In this lab, first we're going to set up the lab, and that's going to involve just kind of giving you a feel for what's going on, showing you the domain, dimensions, the hierarchy, to give you a feel of what we're going to be doing. We're going to go through some Active Directory installations. This will be pretty important because the DNS infrastructure has got to be perfect, especially when we're dealing with child domains inside an Active Directory infrastructure. Then we're going to go down, we're going to talk about what a DNS domain is, okay, in lieu of an Active Directory domain. And we're going to talk then about a DNS delegation, delegating name server authority down to a different DNS server. We'll go through some replication settings that are a little bit different in 2003 and with Active Directory integrated zones. Then we're going to talk about stub zones, a new feature in Server 2003, and then forwarding and conditional forwarding before we finish this off with a brief discussion on caching only DNS servers. Okay, so a lot of topics to cover here, and basically what's going to happen here, we're going to get our internal structure primed and ready to go. Okay, we're going to have multiple machines and just set up the entire internal network. In Lab 4 then, we're going to build our public DNS infrastructure, and we'll set up a live working public DNS infrastructure, and we'll actually go out to a registrar and check out how you make changes and settings just to give you a real good idea and feeling of how you can do this on your own. Okay, let's get started by taking a look at what we're going to do to our domain infrastructure first. Now internally what we're going to be doing is setting up two different domains. We're going to set up our forest root domain, which is going to be WBC, Wired Brain Coffee, but abbreviated, .local. Okay, and internally keep in mind that we can pretty much use anything that we want. If we wanted to, we could use WBC.com or wiredbraincoffee.com. But a good rule of thumb is to use something that's short and concise, like we are here with WBC. And I like to use something that truly identifies this internal domain as a non-functioning internet domain, and .local does a pretty good job of that. Okay, so that's what we're going to name our domain. We're going to have to set up a DNS namespace that revolves around WBC.local, so we'll see how to do that. We're going to set up two domain controllers. That's going to be Server 1 and Server 2. These two domain controllers will be functional and will be domain controllers and DNS servers for this WBC.local. After we have this domain up, functioning, ready to go, then we're going to add a second domain, okay, and that's going to be represented here by Server 3. It's also going to be running Server 2003 and DNS, and what we're going to do here is make this a child domain of WBC.local, and you can see right here it's going to be Spokane.wbc.local. Okay, so Wired Brain Coffee is actually located in Seattle, and then here is going to be our Spokane office. And what we'll do here is just set up one domain controller that will be representative of this particular office. Okay, and what we'll see here is what a DNS domain looks like, and then also how to delegate authority from our DNS servers up here down to the one DNS server down here in Spokane. Okay, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, though. Let's go through this process step by step so you've got a real good feel of how this will work. So I'm going to minimize this, and first thing we're going to do is go over to Server 1, and we're going to build our DNS infrastructure and then run DC promo on Server 1 and make it a domain controller. Okay, so let's form a remote desktop connection over to Server 1. Okay, and it's located at 192.168.1.100 as you see here. Okay, and you've got this blue desktop background here to help us remember that this is Server 1. Now, first things first, let's go up here, and we've already installed DNS. So DNS was installed in Lab 2. But one thing we have remaining is these old forward lookup zones, and we don't really want to have these around anymore. This is going to be confusing, so we're going to blow these out right now on both Server 1 and Server 2. Okay, and we'll go over to Server 2 separately here in a little bit. So right now I'm going to close out Server 2 because I don't want to see it in the wizard right now. So let's just it's not letting me close this out for some reason. I wanted to just get it out of the console here. I bet we can do it someplace up here. File, exit, view. Well, how about we just ignore it for right now? It's just trying to get this off so we don't have to see it in our console, but we'll ignore it for the time being. Okay, forward lookup zone here. What we want to do really is just delete these forward lookup zones. Okay, just like that. So we got rid of our forward lookup zone. We got rid of our reverse lookup zone. These will be orphaned over here on server 2 as well, but we'll delete those, like I said, manually when we're ready to deal with server 2. Okay, so what we're going to do here on server 1, before we install Active Directory, I'd like to get my Active Directory infrastructure set up and in place. Okay, so one thing I always like to do before I do anything else, let's come back over here and take a look at what we've got running here. Okay, server1.wiredbraincoffee.com. This is going to change now. Okay, so let's go ahead and change it ourselves. We'll still leave the name server1, but now instead of wiredbraincoffee, we're going to have wbc.local will be the primary DNS suffix. Okay, so we'll click OK. Click OK again, and it's going to require us to reboot. Before we do that, though, let's get one more step in here before we reboot the system. So I'm going to say no here just for the time being. And now I'm going to set up this forward lookup zone. Okay, so I'm going to go to New Zone. We're going to create a primary zone, and we'll have to upgrade this to Active Directory Integrated here in a little bit, but that's okay. That'll give us some experience in how we can do that. And the zone name is going to be wbc.local, like we specified. We want to leave the default name just like we did in the previous labs. Okay, and for right now, let's just leave this as the default, and we'll worry about changing this after we've upgraded it to an Active Directory Integrated Zone. So we click Next, and then Finish. And if we look here at our local zone, notice that it's not populated with a host record for server 1, and that's because of this entry right here. Okay, this entry is invalid, server1.wiredbraincoffee, at least after we reboot. So let's go ahead and reboot this to make sure we don't have any issues. And then once this system's rebooted, we'll continue on. So I'm going to go ahead and restart the system. That'll disconnect our remote desktop connection. And then I'm going to stop this video, and we'll start it up again as soon as the system has rebooted. Okay, the server has rebooted, so we're going to connect back over to it. Okay, and once again, we're logging back onto server 1 at 192.168.1.100, and we're going to continue on with the DNS settings that we were just looking at a second ago. Now, some of this would be automated if you just went through the DC promo process and didn't bother doing what we're doing. Some of the DNS settings would be taken care of for you. What I'd like to try to do ahead of time is get these all set up, make sure that everything is good there, no problems whatsoever. Okay, so I'm going to go back in here again. Open up DNS. Okay, and let's take a look and see if our record's actually updated. Now we're still showing server1.wiredbraincoffee.com as the name server and then the start of authority here. So let's try something here. First, let's make sure everything looks good here. server1.wbc.local, and it does. Let's go in here again, and instead of messing around with this too much, I'm going to blow this out, and we're going to just recreate it. Okay, probably would have been better if we just rebooted in the first place, obviously. Okay, exact same settings. Click Finish. And now when we open this up, notice that we have name server record, startup authority record, host record that matches our current environment. So a lot less likely to run into issues when we're doing it this way. Okay, and we'll set up a reverse lookup zone record here as well. Just like we did in the previous labs. Okay, and that's all set up. The only thing we don't have is that reverse entry, so we'll go ahead and create that PTR record, and the number here is 100. Okay, so it's server1.wbc.local maps back to 100. So now we have that PTR record as well. Okay, so that pretty much sets up our DNS ahead of time. Now, the only other thing that you may want to consider, you will run across an error message in your DNS. It'll tell you that it's not able to find the actual DNS servers, and the reason it'll do that is because we didn't change this to dynamic. So let's see if we change this, these dynamic updates to non-secure and secure. Let's see if this will actually let us get through the Active Directory installation process without prompting us for more DNS information. Okay, so we're going to do that right now. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and try this out. Okay, so DNS should be set up, ready to go. I'm going to close this, and now we're going to run DC promo from this machine. Okay, welcome to the Active Directory installation wizard, and we'll go through this relatively quickly because this isn't an Active Directory lesson. Okay, but this is going to be a domain controller for a brand new domain. This will be the very first domain controller in a new forest. And the DNS name, like we said before, is going to be wbc.local, just like we see here. We click Next, and it's going to create the NetBIOS name next. And what it should do is chop off the .local and leave us with a nice, easy NetBIOS name of WBC. Okay, and that's what we see here. So then we'll click Next. We'll accept these default locations. Okay, this one as well. And then we get to our diagnostic result, and unfortunately it didn't work. Okay, registration diagnostic has been run one time, or actually it has worked. DNS registration support for this domain controller has been verified. Okay, so we set this up correctly. A lot of times you'll get this and it'll say it's unsuccessful. You'll have three options down here. And you can correct and keep tweaking with the DNS ahead of time. I do recommend that you do that. Try to get it set up and working correctly beforehand. However, it's relatively easy to fix after the fact as well. So don't feel completely flustered if you can't get it quite working. Before you get too far, though, once DNS is running, or once the Active Directory is running, I do suggest that you make sure that Active Directory is okay and your DNS is functioning correctly before you move any further forward, because it's so important that DNS is working right. Okay, we're going to go ahead and leave the defaults here. Okay, here we'll just leave this blank for right now. We'll click Next, and the Active Directory installation process is off and running. Okay, and this will take about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have to reboot, and the reboot after a Active Directory installation is usually quite lengthy. So what we're going to do is let this run its course. I'm going to stop the video, and then once this system has come back up, we're going to take a look at it, and then we're going to look at the next process, which is just basically going to be upgrading the Active Directory zones, and then we'll install the second domain controller on server 2. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video now, and we'll start back up again as soon as this system has rebooted. Okay, server 1 has rebooted, and we're going to go over right now, form a remote desktop connection over to it, and we're going to check out and just make sure that everything went okay. Make sure that Active Directory installed correctly. Let's try that one more time here. We actually have a new username and password now that we've got a domain, so that's why we're stuck here. Okay, and now we're sitting here on server 1. And first things first, let's go ahead and make sure that Active Directory installed correctly. So we'll just go up to the administrative tools. We'll go straight to them here. And we see that we have Active Directory tools in here. So if we open this up, we should see that there's no issues here. Another thing you may want to do, make sure you watch out for any events that pop up. You may get a warning or a informational message that pops up that you want to pay attention to. Okay. So if we look here, everything looks okay. We've got our domain formed wbc.local. So far we have just this one domain controller, server 1. Our next task is going to be to add server 2 and also make it a domain controller as well. Okay, so Active Directory looks okay. Let's take a look at DNS, because this is really what we're focusing on in this lesson. So we're going to open up this DNS console again and take a look at a couple of things that we started setting up previously. Okay, first things first, if we look at our forward lookup zone now, we see that we have wbc.local. If we right-click this and then go to Properties, okay, right here we see that it's currently a primary zone. Okay, not an Active Directory integrated zone. So what we can do here is click Change, and we can change this to an Active Directory integrated zone by checking this box here. Okay, now by doing this, we see that we're going to make this an Active Directory integrated zone, which essentially means that all this zone data, the database file, instead of storing it in a separate file and having to worry about replication as a separate process, it's going to be stored within the Active Directory database, and this will be replicated out to our different domain controllers on the network. Okay, now we only have one domain controller right now, so it's not going to get very far. However, something that is important to know, when we set this up this way, we just made this an Active Directory integrated zone, we can still have our secondary like we still do. Okay, I mean, keep in mind that we have that name server, server 2, we're going to have actually where we do our zone transfer back and forth between server 2, and it's still going to be able to transfer back and forth between those two different servers. Okay, and we wiped out DNS actually, so server 2 is not in this list. But the point I'm trying to make, if you had just a Windows 2000 member server or a Server 2003 member server, or even a different operating system altogether, you can actually do zone transfers from an Active Directory integrated zone down to a secondary zone, just any old DNS software. That'll still work. It doesn't have to be Active Directory integrated. Okay, so we'll accept that for right now. We're going to go ahead and click OK here. Okay, and one thing that before I close that we should have looked at are our dynamic updates. One thing we may want to do here, now that we're running Active Directory integrated, keep in mind that we can change this to secure only, which of course we'll want to do. Even in an internal situation where security is not as big of a problem, it's kind of foolish not to set this setting here. So we'll select secure only. Okay, and then once we've done that, we should be okay. We can click OK now, and that'll be the only changes we focus on right now. Now, there's going to be a couple other things that we need to worry about, and we'll do that since we're sitting on server 1 right now. But we'll take a look at our diagram here. Okay, remember what we're doing. We're going to be adding a second domain controller for wbc.local right now. So the second domain controller will be server 2. Okay, and what we're basically going to have to do is join server 2 to the domain or change some DNS settings. Otherwise, when server 2 attempts to connect to server 1, it's going to have a name resolution issue, and what you're going to find is the Active Directory installation process is going to fail. Okay, so let's go take a look at our options here. Okay, first off, one easy thing to do would just be to connect over to server 2, okay, and make that computer a member of this domain. Okay, and remember what's going to happen. I mean, eventually this wbc.local, we're going to have two domain controllers, server 1 and server 2. What I'm saying you can do is if you join server 2 to this actual domain here, the Active Directory domain, what will happen is it'll take care of the necessary DNS changes that have to take place. Okay, and then once that's accomplished, you won't run into any problems when you go through the DC promo process. Okay, because we're going to go through this step-by-step manually right now. You get a better appreciation of what has to happen. Number one, we'd like to put a host record into this zone. So I'm going to add a host record for server 2. Okay, and to do that, it's just real simple. New host, just like we've done previously, server 2, and we have to specify the IP address once again. And server 2 is over there at .200. Now, we can create an associated PTR record, but if we do this, I don't believe we have a reverse lookup zone set up, so we may get an error message. Let's see. Oh, I guess we did set that up. Okay. So we've got that reverse lookup zone record set up there. And now this is no longer valid, so we're going to get rid of this PTR record. This was from a previous setup, so let's get rid of that. Okay, and now we've got a valid reverse lookup zone, and then also a valid forward lookup zone as well. Okay, so that's one thing that's happened. This is good so far. Now, I think we're done here. We can leave this tool and we'll just close this down. And now what we're going to do is connect over to server 2. Okay, and when we connect over to server 2, what we're going to have to focus on here, if we do an NS lookup, this is kind of going back to what we were dealing with before. Remember what the primary DNS suffix is of this server 2 machine. Okay, right now, let's just go ahead and take a look at that first. It's set up as server2.wiredbraincoffee.com. So essentially, server 2 believes it should belong to this wiredbrain.coffee.com zone. This is where it's pretty much stationed. And remember, we've got a domain name. Our Active Directory domain name is wbc.local. So what would happen right now if we go through the DC promo process, this is going to fail. We're not actually going to be able to get this machine as a domain controller inside the WBC local domain. So what we need to do in this case, we're going to have to change our primary DNS suffix. Okay, and this is that manual process that I was talking about before. If we just made this machine a member server, okay, a member server, if we go to same place here, change, click domain, specify wbc.local, it'll automatically change this DNS suffix for us. It'll do the whole DNS process for us. So that's one way of doing it, of course, but just for troubleshooting purposes, it's definitely helpful to know that this could be messing you up right here. So let's go ahead and click more. And by the way, we're going through this scenario here where we actually have this populated. Under normal circumstances, this would just be blank, right? Okay, because you just installed and this machine's just a standalone server. Well, you're going to have the same problem. So even if it's blank, you're going to have to come in here and add the appropriate primary DNS suffix here. And we're just going to add this domain name wbc.local. Okay, so now I click OK, and now this is going to place server 2 into the appropriate domain and zone within our DNS server. Okay, and we shouldn't have any problems when we attempt to join this machine to the domain or actually run DC promo. And for some reason, it's not giving me the option to click OK here, and we of course want to be able to do that. So let's try and go back in here again. Okay, and we'll click OK, and we'll click OK here again. And we're going to have to reboot this machine. So what we'll do is we'll let this machine reboot. This will kick us back down to our XP system. Okay, and I'm going to stop this video here momentarily. We'll let server 2 reboot, but when we start this video back up again, we'll go through the DC promo process, and it should go off really without a hitch, and we'll talk a little bit about what's in store for us next. Okay, server 2 is rebooted, so we're going to form a remote desktop connection back over to server 2 again. And we'll take a quick gander at this machine just to make sure that everything is okay before we actually run DC promo. So this is my computer, by the way. Remember, it's just been renamed. So I'm right-clicking this, going back to Properties, and we'll take a look at the computer name, and we see now that the computer name is actually server2.bc.local. And one more thing we may want to try, it's actually not may, we need to do this, is go to the Properties of MyNet Replaces, and let's take a look at what our current DNS settings are set at. Okay, so we're going to our IP settings. This all looks good. 200, 24-bit mask, 254 is the gateway. Our preferred DNS server is set appropriately to 192.168.1.100. That's the local machine where we're getting our DNS information from server 1. So if DNS is set up indeed correctly, if we go in here and we run our ns lookup command, we should see right now that this is going to work. Okay, and you see right here no error messages. And we should be able to find our own system in here. If we enter in server 2, we see that it comes up with an entry for server 2. So that's a good sign. If you can get this working, like you see right here, where it resolves server 2, then that's a good thing. It's very likely that you're not going to have any problems when it comes time to do your DC promo and install Active Directory. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to start run, typing in DC promo. And now we're just going to be adding the second domain controller here. Okay, additional domain controller for an existing domain. Username. So now we have to specify the actual username for that domain. This is not a local administrator. This is a domain administrator. Somebody who would be have the ability to be able to join another computer to the domain. Okay, a domain administrator. Okay, and then the domain name is wbc.local. Okay, username, password, domain name. We click Next, and now we get to specify which domain we want to join. And this is the one, wbc.local, or you could have just typed it out if you knew the name. Okay, we're going to accept the default settings here. We're not going to focus too much on these settings in this video. Okay, restore mode password, something you'd want to set in real life. We won't bother with for right now. Okay, and now we look at this and we're ready to start this process. And this is the time right here. You click Next and you either get a failure message here pretty shortly or everything should go okay. So let's watch this for a couple minutes here before we cut off the video just to make sure that everything looks okay. And if you get past the first, let's say 10-15 seconds, good chance that you're going to pull this off without a hitch. And that seems to be what's going on here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this video. It's going to take about 10 minutes to install this, another 5 or 10 minutes to reboot. We'll start this video back up again, and at that time, we'll just continue on our DNS lesson from there. Okay, Server 2 is back up and running, so we're going to connect back over to it and take a look at it just to make sure everything looks okay. Once we have Active Directory confirmed, then we're going to go on to DNS and set up DNS on Server 2 as well. Okay, so we're sitting on Server 2 right now, and what we're going to do here first, let's see if Active Directory installed properly. So we're going to go to All Programs, trying to anyway, Administrative Tools, and then Active Directory Users and Computers. Let's just see if this opens up and we actually have the database replicated over to Server 2. Okay, so we see we have wbc.local, and if we look down here in domain controllers, we do see Server 1 and Server 2. We haven't really set up any users, so we don't see any users here, but we can test this out too, although this isn't really an Active Directory video. So we do have this set up. It looks okay, no problems here. Let's focus on DNS now, though. Let's go ahead and open up our DNS console here once again and see what we're set up with on Server 2's side. Okay, we open up our forward lookup zones, and look what we have right here. wbc.local has actually been copied over here automatically. And this is remnants from before, so we're going to delete this, just make sure we don't have that anymore. Okay, and our reverse lookup zone, we have some remnants left over from what we had worked on before as well. We're not too worried about it right now, though, so we'll leave this alone. All these other PTR records are not really going to affect what we're doing here. Okay, but if you look here, kind of interesting, wbc.local, it's already created this zone for us. We didn't even set this up over here on Server 2, and we've got this configured. Okay, Server 1 and Server 2 host records are set up, and because this is a domain controller, Server 2 is now, we're able to store DNS over here. Okay, so it's no problem. Active Directory integrated DNS is able to be stored over here. Another thing to keep in mind, remember before when we set up our primary and secondary zones on Server 2, this particular zone was a secondary, so we couldn't create new host records. If we went to any of the properties, they were grayed out. We couldn't make any changes to the properties. And if you look here, we didn't make any changes here, but it's already Active Directory integrated. And we see that we have those secure dynamic updates that we were referring to before. Okay, so all that stuff has been taken care of for us without us doing a thing about it. Okay, another thing to note here, we mentioned this in one of the previous videos, but now we're dealing with SRV records, and you may or not be familiar with these SRV records, but these come around when we start using Active Directory integrated DNS. And SRV records are critically important to both Windows 2000 and Server 2003. As a matter of fact, they're required. Without SRV records, okay, there's no way for users on the network or computers on the network to find things like domain controllers and LDAP servers and other services that they may be looking for. Okay, and if we go through here, just to give you a feel for the types of things that are included, well, sites, domains, domain controllers, global catalogs, the PDC emulator. These records here, for example, identify a GUID to the actual server itself, Server 2. Okay, so if we're looking for a domain, for example, this may be how we locate a particular domain. Okay, very similar to Yellow Book phone pages. If you're looking for a pizza man, you check out the yellow pages of the phone book under pizza, and it's going to locate your different pizza stores within your community. Okay, so just a brief note on the SRV records. Now from here, let's take a look at our client machine briefly before we move on to our next section. Now XP1 currently is not a member of this domain, okay? It's still just a standalone client, just a work group if we take a look over here. Okay, and we will join this to the domain here in a second after we've shown a couple more things. But for right now, let's take a look at what happens when we run NSLOOKUP. Okay, our preferred DNS server is still Server 1. Okay, but we're not able to use NSLOOKUP like we were able to before, and that's because this machine still hasn't been updated. Okay, like we just pointed out here a second ago, because it's not a member of the domain right now, and because we still have that old primary DNS suffix, wiredbraincoffee.com, XP1 pretty much has to manually type out any of these entries if it wants to resolve domain names. And this isn't how we'd have a normal network set up. Okay, so for example, to resolve server 1 or server 2, we have to literally type out server 2.wbc.local, and then we're able to get a name resolution. Okay, so that's one thing that we'll take a look at here, but we're going to wait before we change this because it's not really going to affect what we're doing here right now. What I'd like to do is move on to our next section, and that's going to be adding our newest domain controller. So now what we have, we've set up wbc.local as we specified originally. We have two domain controllers, server 1 and server 2. They're both running Active Directory, and we're replicating information back and forth about wbc.local. Now we also have DNS zones, or one DNS zone configured for wbc.local, and these two machines are also acting as DNS servers, passing the DNS information back and forth. Here's where it gets a little bit trickier. Okay, it's when we want to add, child domains to what we already have. Now down here we see that we have the specs drawn out, so we're going to add a domain named spokane.wbc.local. So we're keeping the parent domain here, of course, wbc.local, and we're creating a new Spokane domain for our division over in Spokane. So here we're just going to have one domain controller. This domain controller is server 3. And what we're going to have to do is modify our DNS settings and then go through that Active Directory process just like we did a second ago on server 2. Let's go ahead and minimize this and then talk about what we're going to need to do. Now we really have two choices. And these are, they come down to the same choice we had with server 2, but they're just a touch more complicated. Well, one easy thing that we could do is we could just join server 3 to the wbc.local domain. And what that'll do, it will register server 3. Let me connect over here to server 1 first. It will register server 3 with the wbc local domain, and it'll be actually cached there within the DNS database. Okay, so that's one way we could do it, and then we wouldn't have any problem when we went through and we went on DC promo. Another way of doing it is similar to how we just set up that host record for server 2 and then change the primary DNS suffix. And that's what we're going to do here as well, because I want to give you a better feel for how this works within DNS. Now, keep in mind what we're doing here. We already have a forward lookup zone named wbc.local. However, if you refer back to that map again, remember, we're creating server 3, but it's not in wbc.local. It's actually in spokane.wbc.local. Okay, so we need to create, another entry underneath there. So how do we do this? What are we doing? We're creating a new forward lookup zone? Okay, I mean, is that what we do? We go through here and we create, another primary zone? Well, no, because then they're going to be different databases, and then names won't be able to be resolved, back and forth between them. So in situations like this, okay, and let me describe what this is again. Remember, we're going to have another domain, another DNS domain, and we're going to have resource records down here in Spokane. So not only server 3, but we might have, client 1 and client 2, all sorts of different records that are going to basically be client1.spokane.wbc.local. Okay, so how do we handle that? Right now what we're going to do is create what's called a DNS domain. Okay, and to do that we right-click on WBC local, go down to New Domain, and then type in the name of the new DNS domain. And this is just going to be, you don't have to type the whole thing out, it's just going to be the name of this one DNS domain, so Spokane here. So I click OK, and now you see right here, it's created what looks like a folder. Okay, and it's real similar to what we have up here with the different SRV records. It kind of falls right in line with them. Well, this is different. This is just going to be a DNS domain. If we open this up, this allows us now to populate this area with host records. Okay, so for example, well, we know we need to create a host record for server 3, so we're going to create a new host record. So we type out server 3, and then let's put in the IP address. I believe 230 is the IP address. We're going to have to verify that. So as a matter of fact, let's try a ping right here. If this doesn't work, we're going to have to go to that machine and verify this. Yes. Okay, so that's working, so we don't have to worry about that for later. Okay, now more importantly for us right now, take a look at what happens to the fully qualified domain name. We just typed in the name of that resource, server 3, but since we created this resource in our new Spokane domain, it adds that in here. So our fully qualified domain name is now server3.spokane.wbc.local. If I click Add Host, it creates an entry for server 3, but in the Spokane domain. And the same thing would happen, of course, if we created more host records. You know, we could create a XP3, just some XP client out there in that location. And we'll give it a phony IP address here. Okay, so you know this is what's happening. We're basically populating this DNS domain right now. Okay, and if you look, you know, just open this up again. Take a look at the fully qualified domain name xp3.spokane.wbc.local. Okay, so we've taken care of this part. The next thing we have to do, well, we have to go over to server 3, and we have to specify the primary DNS suffix. Because if we look right now, server 3 is not going to have a primary DNS suffix. It's just going to be, you know, its own root. And it's not going to be able to resolve names. It's not even pointing, I don't believe, to the DNS servers for wbc.local. So that's not going to work. So let's disconnect from here, and we'll form a remote desktop connection over to server 3. Give it a second here. Okay, so we're going to log in on here to server 3. And we really have two things to check. And by the way, you can identify server 3 by this green background. And we should have my computer up here in a second that's been renamed to server 3 as well. Double check on that. I'm not positive. Yeah, it has been done. We have two things we need to do here. Number one, let's go take a look at our TCP/IP settings. Okay, we don't have network places available, so we're going to have to add that in here real quick. Kind of an annoying thing they didn't do in Windows Server 2003 is give us the ability to use my network places. So what's it do? It forces us to go here to our advanced list and customize our start menu by checking this box. You would think on a server that would be something that would be a clear-cut thing you'd want to have there. Okay, so now we have my network places. I'll right-click this and go to Properties. Okay, and this is going to bring up then our network cards. One has been disabled. This one, however, let's go ahead and take a look at what we have configured currently. When I double-click this, this machine's pointing to itself for DNS. It's not what we're going to want here because this machine is not going to handle our DNS name resolution duties in this current environment. Okay, we can set the preferred DNS server to 100 and no problem whatsoever to set the preferred DNS server here to 200. Okay, because we are, I'm sorry, the alternate DNS server, because now we have two DNS servers on our Active Directory network. If one of these fails, we'll just go down to the alternate. Okay, so we'll click OK here, we'll accept these settings, and the next thing we want to do is take a look at the primary DNS suffix. Okay, right now it's just flat out server 3, so when this computer attempts to do anything as far as name resolution is concerned, you know, it's just looking in its local, you know, zone. There's no place else that it's actually looking. So it's going to have all sorts of problems when it's trying to use DNS with the DNS servers it's currently pointing to. How do we change that? Well, just like we have in the past, let's go here and change our actual primary DNS suffix name. So here what we're going to need to do is just type in the DNS suffix, and you're going to need to make sure that you remember we have to put in spokane.wbc.local. Okay, server 3 will be added to it, and then we see what it's going to look like if everything goes okay once we've rebooted. Server3.spokane.wbc.local. So I have to click OK 4 times here, and we're going to have to restart server 3 for these changes to take effect. So we'll go ahead and restart that, and while we're waiting, we'll stop this video. We'll start it up again once server 3 is rebooted, and we'll finish off this DC promo process from here. Okay, server 3 has rebooted, it's back up and running, but before we go over there, let's take a look at one thing we did here. I took care of a little housekeeping while the video was down, and I actually joined XP1 to that wbc.local domain, so we didn't have to do that later. So what you'll notice here after we join this computer to the domain is, of course, it's now part of the domain wbc.local, but another thing that happens anytime you make the computer part of a domain, it automatically changes that primary DNS suffix for you that we've been focusing on. Okay, so you can see that it's wbc.local here as well. And here's that same setting we were just referring to. Okay, and that's change primary DNS suffix when domain membership changes. With this checkbox checked, that's what's happening. If we made this machine join a different domain, it would once again change the primary DNS suffix for us. Okay, and in doing so, now when we run the NS lookup command, you'll see that everything goes a lot smoother. We're able to connect over to our preferred DNS server without a problem. And then if we want to start doing some name resolutions, we can just type in the host name instead of having to type in the fully qualified domain name, and we get our name resolutions a lot easier. Okay, now one thing it doesn't do for us, you see right here I've tried typing in server 3. And the reason it doesn't resolve this name for me is basically because we're sitting here on wbc.local. Well, server 3 is over in Spokane. Okay, we haven't seen that yet, we haven't verified that, but trust me, it is. So we can go to server 3.Spokane, and if you want, you can type out the fully qualified domain name, but what we've typed here is enough. We've given it enough context where we're basically saying, here's the computer name, here's the domain name, now add on my primary DNS suffix, which is wbc.local. Okay, and as you see here, it resolves this name back down to an IP address, so it's working out, without any problem whatsoever. Okay, so our client machine is all set and ready to go, so we're going to go ahead and exit here, and next what we'll do is connect over to server 3, and we're going to work on managing server 3 here. Going to change our password so we can connect without a hitch. Should work anyway. Let's see what happens. And it does. Okay. Now let's verify the settings that we just changed a second ago. So I right-click my computer. It has been renamed to server 3. Go to Properties, Computer Name. Okay, and we see right here that the primary DNS suffix is server3.spokane.wbc.local. We're still a member of a work group. Okay, so if you look here, we didn't take the easy way out and make this computer a member of a domain, because that will change this for us. We went through it, went about it the old-fashioned hard way. Okay, so we've got this set up. Next thing we can do is really start focusing on running the DC promo process and going through Active Directory. Now, before you do that, though, let's do this. You should use NSLookup and make sure that you don't really have any DNS problems. So when I enter in NSLookup here, I see that I am able to connect over to server 1. I can connect to server 2. I can find the IP address for XP1. How about my local system here? What if I type in server 3? Yes, I can also resolve this IP address as well. Okay, so no problem. I'll resolve this domain name as well. Okay, and I'm going to type out the fully qualified domain name just to make sure that there's no issues with this working either. Okay, you can see that it resolves all of these without any problems. Okay, so this looks good. Our DNS seems like it's working just fine, so I feel comfortable then going in here and running DC promo. So we're going to go through this Active Directory installation wizard, and it's going to be somewhat the same, but there are going to be some key differences here that you need to focus on. Okay, here's the first one. Now this is not a domain controller, or it actually is a domain controller for a new domain. In the last section we talked about adding an additional domain controller for wbc.local. Well, we're adding the Spokane domain, so it's actually a brand new domain controller for a brand new domain. So I click Next, and here's my second change here. Before we added a domain in a new forest, okay, we actually didn't even have this option when we added the second domain controller. Well, this is not going to be a new forest. This is going to be a child domain in an existing domain tree. We already have the tree wbc.local. We're just adding on to this tree. Okay, and this last option here is not appropriate either. This would be if we wanted a completely different tree within the same forest. This is kind of out of the context of what we're dealing with right now, so we won't go into it. So the second option is what we want to do. And now what we need to do is authenticate, provide the authentication that we're going to need to actually add this child domain to the forest. So I'm going to have to specify either a domain administrator or an enterprise administrator. Actually, this is going to have to be an enterprise administrator for the wbc.local forest. And in our case, it's one and the same, so it's no big deal here. It's administrator, then I've got the password we're using here, then the domain name wbc.local. Okay, it looks like that checks out. Okay, the parent domain then. Browse for this, and this is where we're going to be adding wbc.local. I click OK, and now the child domain. And the next thing is it fills this in down below for you, so you can kind of see, get a visual on whether or not you're doing this correctly. Okay, Spokane.wbc.local. I think that's okay. So we'll click Next. It's going to go out there. It's going to check in with wbc.local. Wants to make sure that all of this is okay. We have to have certain FSMA roles present for this to take place. We're checking to make sure that this name is not in use. Okay, we'll accept the defaults here. Okay, and now we're to that magical moment, where we're about to test out, make sure that everything works okay. And if you look here, even Active Directory agrees with us. The test for dynamic DNS update support returned. The operation completed successfully. Okay, so that's a good thing. So we'll click Next here, and we'll leave this default, make it more secure. Leave this password here blank for now. Normally we wouldn't, but this isn't an Active Directory video. And now we're to the moment of truth. We click Next here, and then hopefully this goes through without a hitch. Okay, and believe me, DNS is very important to Active Directory, so if you want this to go off without a hitch, it's really not too difficult, provided you get your DNS infrastructure in place, set up correctly ahead of time. Okay, we're going to let this run its course, so I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll pick it up again once Server 3 has finished the Active Directory installation process and then is rebooted. Okay, Server 3 has Active Directory installed and has rebooted, so we're going to connect over to it just briefly here, and we want to verify that Active Directory installed correctly. So we'll just check here. We'll go to Start, up to Administrative Tools, and then open up Active Directory Users and Computers. We'll just do a quick check, make sure it looks okay. Here's the domain name, spokane.wbc.local. That looks okay, and then when we click on the domain controller's OU, it shows that Server 3 is the one and only domain controller for this domain. Okay, and remember that's accurate, because for the wbc.local domain, we're going to have two domain controllers, but those will not be listed here. Okay, so we can close this, and we're really done here on Server 3. And then we'll open up our diagram and talk about the next section, which is going to be DNS delegations. Okay, so we just talked about DNS domains. Let's compare and contrast a little bit and talk about what the differences are between DNS domains and DNS delegation. Okay, DNS domains, this is what we set up originally, and this is something that just happens by default anytime you add an additional Active Directory domain. So for example, we just added spokane.wbc.local, an Active Directory domain. When you do this, it also adds to your DNS namespace. Okay, if you recall, if we connect over to Server 1, and we will be doing this in a second, you're going to see what's represented as a folder with the name Spokane there. Okay, and any resource then that exists in this particular domain, so our XP3 machine or any other server that we may have, is going to have the fully qualified domain name of XP3, for example, .spokane.wbc.local. And it's going to be placed appropriately in that particular folder in that DNS namespace. Okay, however, and this is really where it's important, when we have DNS domains, what's happening, those machines are configured to talk to our main name servers that exist across this wide area network here. So what we'd like to do is, instead of relying upon some, couple DNS servers up here in our Seattle headquarters, why not bring our DNS here local? If our DNS is local here in Spokane, we don't have to worry about these guys being out to lunch. We don't have to worry about the replication traffic that's flowing across this wide area network link as well. So let's go talk about how we can do this. We're going to connect back over to server 1. Okay, and once we're on server 1, let's change this first off. Okay, once we're on server 1, now what we're going to do is just go back into our DNS console and we'll try to decipher what I was just saying a second ago in theory. Okay, now recall a second ago that I told you that in wbc.local we have this Spokane domain. Okay, and what would happen within this domain, what you're going to see are all the different resource records. Here you see a host record for 192.168.1.230. This stuff would happen automatically without us doing anything. Okay, these are resource records that have been populated to our name servers up here in Seattle. Okay, the problem with this though, like I said a second ago, well, anytime we're doing any sort of name resolution or registration, we have to cross that wide area network. So what I would prefer to do is not have server 1 or server 2 have any responsibility for the Spokane namespace. So what we're going to do is what's called delegating the zone. Okay, this right here, we're going to delegate this, which basically means just give responsibility to a different DNS server. Okay, now in Windows 2000 to do this, we just had to basically click up here, okay, which is the the main zone, right click and then go down to New Delegation. Okay, and what will end up happening, it would convert this domain into a delegated zone. Well, in 2003, it actually gives us an error message at the end, and it tells us we can't do that. So what we're going to do is just cancel this or delete this, get rid of it altogether. Okay. I know it's kind of scary deleting that, but it would be easily replaced, by the way, if you went back over. Let's say that you accidentally deleted it and decided that you didn't mean to do it. Well, what you can do is just go back over to your server 3 machine, the domain controller that we just set up, and run that ipconfig register DNS command, and that'll re-register all that information here within the zone. Well, we're going to create a new delegation instead, though. So we're going to go down here to New Delegation and go through this New Delegation wizard. Okay, and it tells us right here what it's for. This helps us delegate authority for a subdomain to a different zone, either on this DNS server or on another DNS server, and that's what we're going to be doing. Zone delegation can help simplify administration. Well, it's kind of confusing at first, but I agree. Once it's set up, it's pretty simple, and it does simplify the whole process. Okay, to delegate a domain, what we need to do is specify the domain we're going to delegate, which is going to be Spokane, and it automatically fills in the fully qualified domain name below. So you just need to enter in Spokane up here. So we click Next, and now we need to actually browse. Okay, we could browse, but we no longer have a name record for it. We need to browse for our server 3 machine. Now, server 3 had existed within that domain that we just deleted. So if we browse here, for example, we're going through our resource records, server 1 and then forward lookup zones. And here's the zone name. Okay, well, server 3 doesn't exist anymore, so we can't really browse for it. So it's kind of a pain. Can kind of be misleading, make you think you didn't do something correctly. Well, we're just going to have to type out the name. Okay, and it's just server 3 .spokane.wbc.local. Okay, and then you need to know the IP address. In our case, that IP address is 192.168.1.230. So we click Add here. Let's double check our work, because this will definitely lead to problems if we misconfigure it. If we click OK, click Next, and then Finish, and that's it. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Now when we look here, Spokane, we see this, it looks similar to how it was before, except it's got this little piece of paper on it, and it's also kind of got a gray look to it, or ghosted out look. And that just indicates that this particular name in this namespace has been delegated. No longer are name server 1 and name server 2 responsible for Spokane. Okay, so we've delegated it to a different server, and lo and behold, hey, here's the server we've delegated it to. Here's the name server. So basically what they're saying, some client, XP1 for example, comes up and says, hey, I'm looking for server 5.spokane.wbc.local. What's the IP address? Well, these servers here, server 1 and server 2, they go, well, We used to handle that name resolution, but now we've delegated that. We have to delegate. We're too busy. So, go talk to this server and see if they can help you out. And then we refer them down to server3.spokane.wbc.local. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but how do we actually get there? What's the IP address for server3.spokane.wbc.local? Okay, well, in this case right here, you think, well, let's go ahead and add some records. Well, when I click in here, there is no way for me to add records. Okay, there's nothing here. Okay, which is kind of misleading. You go, well, wait a second. How can I put new records in for Spokane? Well, the thing is, we don't add those here. Okay, DNS records, they're going to be created over here on server 3. So let's go take a look at that. We're going to go ahead and just close this down. And now we're going to go over and we're going to connect to server 3. Okay, in server 3 we definitely have to have DNS installed, and I believe that we do from a previous video that was shown. So let's go ahead and try to open that up. Okay, and we do here. Okay, and there's currently no forward lookup zone, so that's good. So we can start with a clean slate here. And we're just going to right click, go to new zone, and then walk through this forward lookup zone process. Okay, now what are we creating here? Okay, we're creating a primary zone, secondary zone, stub zone. Okay, and we'll talk about these. Well, this actually, even though we're creating a delegated zone, we have the ability to create it any way we want. Okay, now we don't want to do a secondary because we have nowhere to get that information, all the name records from. So we're really either creating a primary zone or an Active Directory integrated zone. And since we're running Active Directory, it makes a heck of a lot of sense to store all this information within Active Directory. So let's create an Active Directory integrated zone, which we do by specifying primary and also leaving this box down below checked. Okay, now we just need to click Next, which will advance us to the next screen. Okay, and then make a decision here. And this is something we have not seen already, and we're going to go back and take a look at this setting on Server 1 and Server 2 as well. Okay, and this is a new feature in Server 2003. And if we read up here, this allows us to select exactly how we want DNS data replicated throughout the network. Okay, 3 different choices. We're going to start from the option selected here, the default option. Okay, the first selection is to all domain controllers in the Active Directory domain spokane.wbc.local. Okay, and this is the default way we did it in Windows 2000. Okay, this is a perfectly acceptable method, but we have a couple other choices as well. This top selection replicates this DNS zone information to all DNS servers in the Active Directory forest. Okay, and this is useful if you want all of the DNS information to be stored throughout the forest. This will greatly speed up things. Okay, you'll get a lot more, lot quicker response times by choosing this top option. The downside is if you have some weak wide area network connections, some low bandwidth connections, well, DNS resolutions and the registrations and the zone transfers can take up a considerable amount of bandwidth. So this might not be something you want to specify for your option, for your company. And then our middle option, our last option we'll talk about, to all DNS servers in the Active Directory domain. Okay, and the difference between these two, this is to all domain controllers, this is just to all DNS servers. Okay, and either way is really okay. It's not going to make a big difference either way, but keep in mind you may have, just to throw out a number, 5 domain controllers. Not necessarily all of them have to be DNS servers, and that's what the difference is between these. Maybe only 3 of the 5 domain controllers are running DNS. So by selecting this option, we're only going to be specifying or replicating to all DNS servers in the Active Directory domain. Okay, let's just leave the default for right now. It's not really going to affect what we're doing. We'll click Next. Okay, what's the zone name? And it's important that you get this and you match it up correctly. Okay, this zone name that we're going to be using here, okay, is going to be set up as spokane.wbc.local. Okay, spokane.wbc.local. So we click Next. We want to allow only secure dynamic updates recommended for Active Directory, so we'll go ahead and go with that option. Okay, and then click Finish. Okay, and now we're all set up. We have this zone created here, spokane.wbc.local, and as we see right here, it's populated it full of records already. If we take a look, we've got a start of authority record. Okay, we have a name server record. This is indicating who's authoritative for this particular DNS domain here, Spokane. And we have a couple host records that were automatically created. Okay, we have what's called a glue record. This is just gluing this information, the name server record, server 3 to an actual IP address. And then here's just the normal host record that we see for server 3 as well. Now we can start using this. This is a separate DNS database, so we can start populating this database with new host records if we desire. And we'll just add a record for XP, let's call it 33 here. Okay, and add the IP address. Okay, so it's as simple as that as far as the host record. It's just the same old thing, but down here on this new zone that we created. In addition, we can right-click here, go to Properties, and we have all of those same settings that we dealt with before. Okay, so same types of settings that we went over in an earlier video. Okay, so it's important to realize that when we create this, it's creating a brand new database. We're segmenting this portion of the DNS database from the other portion. Okay, and one of the main reasons we do this is for efficiency. Maybe the DNS database was just getting too large, and passing that information across the WAN connection was just too great. So that's why we might split it up, as you see here. Okay, let's take a look at what actually happens. Let's test out this delegation and see it in action. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and we're back here on our XP1 client, and we're going to test some name server lookup records here. So from a command prompt, I'm going to enter in NS lookup. I have to spell that right first. Okay, and you can see that the preferred DNS server is still set up as server1.wbc.local as it has been throughout this video series. Okay, so no problem there. If we want to resolve server 2, okay, you see that it's also able to resolve server 2 for us. Okay, there's no issues there. How about server 3? If I enter in server 3 here, okay, we end up getting a non-existent domain. Can't find server 3. Okay, so what we have to do is specify a little bit more information. It's actually server3.spokane. Okay, and we could put in the fully qualified domain name, but we don't need to. We put in enough. And let's take a look at what happens here. When we enter in this entry, when we're actually looking for server3.spokane.wbc.local, we go out and we still query our preferred DNS server. But since server 1 is no longer authoritative over this Spokane domain, look what it does. It actually sends a referral out to server 3. Okay, and it tells us right here this is a non-authoritative answer, indicating to us that server 1 is just not authoritative over this zone. And server 3 then responds back to server 1 and says, hey, here's that information, 192.168.1.230. That's the information you're looking for. Let's do another example with that XP33 machine that we were just talking of. And this time we'll just type out the fully qualified domain name to make sure that you're catching on to what we're dealing with here. Okay, xp33.spokane.wbc.local. Okay, and when we put this in, we actually get server1.wbc.local. That's where we're checking. And then it comes back with xp33.spokane.wbc.local. Now, for some reason, it didn't come up with this non-authoritative answer. It must have cached this entry or something here. Let's see why it might have done that. I'm going to run NS lookup. Flush DNS. Let's get rid of that cache. Oops, what am I doing here? ipconfig. Flush DNS. Okay, so that flushes out the DNS resolver cache, and now we're going to go right back in once again to NS lookup. Okay, and I'm going to look for that XP33 machine again. Okay, now this time I do get it's a non-authoritative answer, okay? And it tells me right here what the deal is. You're looking for xp33.spokane, and I shorthanded it here, but we could have just filled it out, .wbc.local. We always check with our preferred DNS server first at 192.168.1.100. That server did not know the answer. Okay, it's not able to resolve that host anymore, so it referred it to the machine that it knows that's authoritative for WBC or Spokane.wbc.local, who is that server 3 machine. Now notice we don't see that server even mentioned here, but that's okay because it gives us the answer that we were looking for anyway, 192.168.1.33. Now if we enter in xp33.spokane here again, we still get that same information. It shows us that it's still a non-authoritative answer. It's been cached that way within the local cache. Okay, let's go take one more quick look over at server 1 just to make sure you're comfortable with how it's set up over there. So we're just going to open up the DNS tool once again. Okay, and here we're looking in the forward lookup zones. Here's wbc.local, and then here's our delegation. Okay, and it's really, I mean, there's not a lot to do to it. All that we did was right-clicked here, went to New Delegation, boom, went through that delegation wizard. The only thing you really need to know ahead of time is A, the name of the domain, because that's got to match up. We want to make sure that matches up to our Active Directory domain. And then B, the name of the DNS server and also the IP address. Okay, so you're going to need that information. Then you have to remember, you have to go over to that server 3 machine, the machine that we're delegating to, and then set up the forward lookup zone as we just did. Okay, so we've got that squared away and all set up. Okay, let's take a look here at what we're going to cover next. So we've gone through DNS domains, DNS delegation. DNS replication settings are really referring to the new feature in Server 2003 where we can replicate in the multiple ways, across forest or just amongst DNS servers within 2003. Now we're going to take a look at stub zones. And this is also a new feature in Server 2003. A touch confusing at first, I think, until you start to appreciate when you might use a stub zone. Okay, so we'll take a look at stub zones, and then we'll go forward and we'll look at DNS forwarders as well as conditional forwarders. Okay, a stub zone. We're going to connect over to server 3 for this particular example and give you a feel for how this will work. Okay, and remember, server 3 is sitting over here in Spokane, across a slow WAN connection over to Seattle. That's kind of the scenario that we're putting into play here. Okay, we're going to form a remote desktop connection over to server 3 and just take a quick look at what we're dealing with here on server 3 before we continue on. So I'm going to open up the DNS console on server 3. And what you need to realize right now is that server 3 is pointing to itself for all of its DNS name resolution. Okay, so when we look here at server 3 locally, the only thing it has is a local zone. So it's going to look into Spokane.wbc.local. It's going to be able to resolve server 3 and XP33, but not a whole heck of a lot else. Okay, so what we want to do right now is come up with some way to give it some more, some name resolution power throughout the domain structure. Okay, and one way we can do that is to set up a secondary zone here. Now, I'm not recommending that you do this. There's some better ways, especially now that we have stub zones in Server 2003. But we're going to go through a secondary zone first because I think it'll offer some clarity as to what a stub zone is. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this because we need to connect over to server 1 and approve, add the actual name server for server 3 so we can pass these zones back and forth. Okay. So we're just going to open up the DNS console over on server 1. Okay, and then from within here, all that we really need to do is just go here to server 1. We'll open up the forward lookup zone, right-click, go to Properties, come up here to Name Servers, and we're going to add server 3 to this list. So server 3.spokane.wbc.local. Down below, we'll add the IP address. Click Add. And then OK. Okay, and we can see that we've got this now added to the list. We're going to do the same thing on server 2, just to make sure there's no issues here whatsoever. So we go to Properties, name servers, add, and we'll add the exact same system over here. Okay, put the IP address. Okay, double check it, make sure it's okay, and then we should be all set right now. Okay, so what we've done basically is we have given server 3 the ability to have or to accept zone transfers from server 1 and server 2. This has to be authenticated because of the setting that we have here. In case you don't remember over here on zone transfers we have this allow zone transfers but only to servers listed on the name servers tab. Okay, and that's why we just added those names. Okay, so we're done here, so let's disconnect. We're going to go back over to server 3. Now in server 3 what we're going to do is just set up a secondary zone, and the secondary zone will allow us to resolve names now from those upper level domains. So we're going to create a secondary zone, and it's just going to be exactly what you'd expect, wbc.local. Click next, and now the address or addresses of the master DNS servers. Just for simplicity, we're just going to add the one address here. This is of server 1. Okay, then we click next and finish. And when we open this up, we see that the zone transfer actually took place. And all this information was passed across the WAN. Okay, and now we've got complete records. Server 1, server 2, server 77, XP1. All of these are stored in our local zone. Okay, and let's take a look at why this is significant. Okay, here on server 3, if we take a look at our IP settings, our preferred DNS server is set up to point to 192.168.1.230. In other words, this server. Okay, so if I run NS lookup right now, okay, you see that I resolve back to this server, and I am able to resolve different names. Here we see XP33, this is from our local system, and then I could also try to resolve XP77. That doesn't work, however, because I need to specify something outside my primary DNS suffix, which is just going to be spokane.wbc.local. Okay, maybe I got the name of it correct. Server 77 instead of XP77. So let's try that again. We'll enter in server 77 here. Okay, and then server 77 can't be found either. Let's see if we mistype this in. Nope. Okay, up here, a couple mistakes. First, this was just a wrong client name. Then we have an extra domain that shouldn't be there. Now we're putting in server77.wbc.local, which is where this host exists. Okay, now when I hit enter, we see that we do get the name resolution. It resolves it back down to the IP address 192.168.1.77, which we can see down below is correct. Okay, so what we've done in essence here is we've allowed this DNS server, server 3, to resolve names for anything in Spokane as well as anything in this wbc.local zone. Okay, now the problem is we're kind of right back where we started from before. I mean, why are we transferring the secondary zone down here to Spokane? You know, right now it's fairly small, but what about when we have 1,000 or 2,000 records here? The database itself may take a considerable amount of time when we're replicating this information back and forth. Okay, so right now, just to kind of reiterate what we have, we've taken a copy of the full database from server 1 and we've copied it here local in Spokane to server 3. Instead of doing that, though, we can use a new feature in server 2003 called stub zones. Okay, so what we're going to do first is get rid of this zone. Okay, so let's pretend like, hey, this is a bad idea. We don't want this here. It's taking up way too much bandwidth. Let's come up with a better alternative. So I'm going to delete this. And now what we're going to do is start from forward lookup zones again, go to new zone, and this time we're going to choose the option for stub zone. Okay, now we're not going to store it in Active Directory. This will result in an error message. So stub zone, next. Now we need the zone name. It's going to be just as if we were setting up a secondary with a little bit of a difference in the end. So I'm typing in wbc.local. So this is going to be a stub zone for wbc.local. This is great for a file name. Then we need the IP address of at least one of the masters, and it's a good idea to put both of them in here. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so you see both DNS masters, and I'm going to click Next, and then I click Finish. Okay, now when I open this up now, take a look at what's included within here. Now, it doesn't look like a significant difference because we didn't have too many records before. But all that we get now is our start of authority record, a name server record, and then the glue record that tells us who this actual name server is. Okay, now this is real important because now what's going to happen, instead of giving every last host, remember before we had server 77 and we had XP1, and if we had 1,000 different hosts, all those host records would have come over in a normal secondary. What a stub zone does, it copies only enough information, only enough information to be able to resolve names back to wbc.local. Okay, so now when somebody comes to server 3 for DNS name resolutions, we're going to ask, for example, let's say that we want to know about server 77.wbc.local. This request is put into server 3. It consults here, wbc.local. It knows that server 77 doesn't exist. However, since this is a stub zone, it's going to send this request over to one of the configured name servers, either server 1 or server 2. Okay, so that's what ends up happening here. So they'll send the request over to server 1 and server 2. That will cross, the wide area network. However, a simple request like that doesn't happen very often is a much better use of bandwidth and will consume a lot less than copying over that full, zone database each time. Okay, so that's what's going to happen in effect now. So when we come back here and we start doing our DNS name resolutions again, from our perspective here, we should really notice no difference. Okay, server 77 dot, oops, gotta leave that Spokane out of there, wbc.local. Okay, and when I hit enter, notice that it still is able to resolve this. We're going to pull this down here to the bottom. Notice it's still able to resolve server 77 back to .230, oops, .77, even though that host record does not exist here within this zone. Okay, and the reason, because it's a stub zone. Okay, and what's happening is this request for server 77, although server 3 takes it, it's going to forward it off to either name server 1 or 2, and then the request is sent back to server 3. So server 3 then returns the IP address and gives you the correct answer. Okay, so that's a stub zone, kind of a cool new thing that we have now in server 2003. Now there are some other ways we can handle this. Okay, and let's talk about a couple of these. Let's assume that we don't want to mess with these zones at all. Okay, we're still not happy with what's going on here. Maybe we don't want to maintain this many records. Okay, it's still too many. We have a couple other options. We can use forwarders, okay, which we talked about in Windows 2000, and we also have what's called a conditional forwarder now. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this zone. Okay, and now what we're going to do is talk about forwarders and then also those traditional forwarders and then conditional forwarders, the new ones as well. So I'm just going to right-click Server 3, go to Properties, okay, and then here we see that we have the Forwarders tab. When I click Forwarders, this is pretty similar to what we had before. Okay, the default setting up here, all other DNS domains, this is just basically everything. If it's not spokane.wbc.local, I'm going to forward it to whatever is configured here. Okay, so this I'm going to use for, let's say, a ISP's IP address. So I'm going to use Earthlinks 207.69.188.187. So any requests that come out, let's say to www.google.com, well, those won't be resolved within this namespace. We'll have to forward those out to the internet, or Dell.com or Microsoft.com, any of those other internet domain names. Okay, so this is configuring a forwarder. Now, one thing that I do want to use when we do configure a forwarder is this option down below, do not use recursion for this domain, which will just give us an added layer of security. And we'll talk more about that in a second here. So when I click OK here, and then let's go back to a command prompt. Let's see what happens when I run nslookup. Okay, now, if I type in www. let's go with something we haven't used, Dell.com. You can see that we get a non-authoritative answer, okay, and then here's the server that ends up, or here's the www server, here's the IP address for it, okay, so this is the name, here's an alias for it, www.dell.com. But this machine itself, server 3, did not have this answer in its database because, see here, it's returning a non-authoritative answer. Another thing we can do, let's assume still that we want to get to the domain wbc.local. Okay, remember server 77 that we're trying to query here a second ago? Let's first flush our cache out here so we don't have that entry here messing us up. Okay, so I flushed out my DNS cache, make sure there's no problems with that. Let's run ns lookup again. Okay, and let's see if we can get out to server 77. Okay, now we're still able to get there. Somehow or another we must still have this cache, or it could be even in our local NetBIOS cache. But let's use a different host record. I'm trying to think of maybe XP1. Okay, there we go. XP1's the client machine. This is actually in our host file, in the zone database. Okay, but we're not able to resolve it. Okay, XP1 we're not able to resolve. So if I type in xp1.wbc.local, let's make sure that we can't even resolve this. Okay, and as you see here, we're not even able to resolve this either. Okay, well, what can we do about this if we want to be able to resolve internet names and still be able to resolve names over at the wbc.local domain? What we can do is create what's called a conditional forwarder. Okay, and to create a conditional forwarder, right-click up here on the server itself, go to Properties, Forwarders, and then all that we really have to do is just click New. Okay, and now we're going to specify the DNS domain. Okay, so what we're going to specify here is wbc.local. Click OK, and then specify who we want to forward this to. What DNS server do you want to forward this to? And we're going to forward this off to the DNS server that services wbc.local, which, as we've specified a bunch of times, is 192.168.1.100 or 1.200. Okay, so either one of these. So now I click OK. Okay, and what should happen is if we perform the same lookup here, xp1.wbc.local, you see now we're able to actually resolve this name. Okay, let's talk about what's happening here. A request comes in to server 3 for xp1.local.wbc.local. And what's happening, it checks first its forward lookup zone, and that does not exist within Spokane. Okay, then it has to go through its forwarders, or it checks its other zones actually. It doesn't have any other zones here. So the next thing that happens is checks its forwarders. And we have two different forwarders configured. We have the conditional forwarder that we were just speaking of. Okay, and this conditional forwarder is set up so that anything that has a wbc.local suffix, that's going to be forwarded to one of these two IP addresses. If it doesn't match this, then it's going to be forwarded out to our internet ISP. Okay, so then what we get now is kind of the best of both worlds here. We can have just multiple forwarders set up depending upon what domain name is specified. Okay, and then, we could mess this up. Just a second ago we were able to get out to Dell.com. Remember that? Well, if I wanted to, I could add a forwarder in here for Dell.com. Okay, and then I click OK, and then let's say that we're going to specify server 1 here again. Okay, 192.168.1.100. So what this is saying then, it's a conditional forwarder that says anytime you get a DNS suffix that's Dell.com, forward it here. This machine's going to be able to take care of it. Okay, now when we forward it out to this machine, it's not going to be able to take care of it. The only thing it may be able to do is forward it out to the internet from there. So let's see what happens just out of curiosity. Okay, so we didn't get it directly, or we can't tell if we actually got it directly. What I'd like to do is exit this. Let's try flushing this once first. Okay, and now let's try this again, see what happens. Okay, we're still end up getting this. It's still either in the cache, and it's possible too that the DNS server over on server 1 is resolving that name for us. So what we'd have to do if we didn't want that to happen, if we, and there's no reason why we want to break this, but if we really wanted to, we could go out there and change a couple other settings to, prevent that from happening. Okay, anyway, the point here is we want to get a feel for how we can use these forwarders, okay, the regular forwarders and also the conditional forwarders. Now, on a final note here between these stub zones and conditional forwarders, let's talk about what the difference really is, why we would use one or the other one, okay? A stub zone, okay, is very, very helpful here, like in this internal situation, and a stub zone's nice because it's somewhat dynamic. Anytime a entry changes, let's say that we change the name servers over there in wbc.local, if they changed the name server name or added some other master name servers, that would automatically be updated because it would occur through a zone transfer. So that's somewhat of a good thing. You've got a dynamic update occurring there, so your zone is always up to date. Forwarders are helpful because they're real simple to configure, as you saw, and it also gives you some more granularity on exactly what you want to happen. Now, it is more of a manual process. I mean, we had to go in there and actually put in those forwarders, but for the most part, you're not going to be configuring a bunch of different forwarders. I mean, you might be able to get away with, one or two different forwarders to solve your problem. So either one of them will work. It's just a matter of what's going to suit your environment best. Okay, the last thing we have on our docket here is just caching only DNS servers. Okay, and this is a real simple one here. We talked about these in Windows 2000. Not much has changed in Server 2003. If you want to set up a caching only DNS server, do you remember how you do it? Okay, it's real simple. You install DNS and you do nothing else. If we wiped out these zones here, took away the forward lookup zone, so there was no forward lookup zone and no reverse lookup zone, you basically have a caching only DNS server. Okay, and what's essentially happening, all DNS requests that were forwarded through it are just going to be cached there. And this is something that's real helpful. You could put one of these out on your DMZ, the public side of your firewall. And when you do that, you can have all your DNS servers forwarding through this caching only DNS server, and the net result will be much faster DNS name resolutions and a DNS server that's a little bit more locked down and less of a security risk for you since it doesn't have any zones in it whatsoever. Okay, that wraps up Lab 3. Kind of a long one, a lot of confusing topics. What we're going to do is take this information, though, and leverage this into Lab 4. We will go back a little bit. We're going to try to offer some clarity when we start off Lab 4, and we go into the public side of DNS. So in Lab 4, we're going to talk about split brain DNS, how we set up DNS on the internal side versus the external side or the public side, and get this kind of more in line so you got a real good comfort level of how you can configure DNS on your internal and external network if you do want to host DNS servers yourself. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here real soon.